we have sufficiently caffeinated you after what was as I said, exciting and continually gloomy presentation. I'm Erin Scharf at the ASU School of Law, and I am excited to present what I hope will be a panel that is less doom and gloom. Richard flinches. Potentially some bright spots. And this is the Local Elections Administration panel. There's, I think, significant synergy with the panel that we thought about calling it overlap. I'm going to think of it as synergy between the exciting panel that follows. So we're going to have short presentations and then hopefully dialogue among my esteemed panelists. To my right is my co-author, Richard Briffault, who is the Joseph P. Chamberlain Professor of Legislation at Columbia Law School. His work has focused for a very long time on state and local government law and the law of political process and government ethics. Then to his left is Mitchell Brown, who is the Curtis O. Lyles III Professor of Political Science at Auburn University and is the founding editor of the Journal of Election Administration Research and Practice. She serves on the board of the directors of the National Association of Election Officials, the Election Center, and has held board and leadership positions at the university, in state government, and in nonprofit organizations. To her left is Professor Josh Douglas of the University of Kentucky J. David Rosenberg College of Law, where he is the Ashland Spears Incorporated Distinguished Research Professor of Law. He is the author of Vote for Us. Vote for Us. I should have practiced. Vote for the U.S. and Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting, a book that provides hope and inspiration for a positive path forward on voting rights. Super exciting after several days of discussion. And then to his left is Rebecca Green, who is an associate professor of law at William & Mary Law School, where she teaches election law, privacy law, and alternative dispute resolution, and co-directs the election law program, a joint project of the law school and the National Center for State Courts that provides resources for judges on election law topics. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for being here. Richard, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, although I'm tempted to, I think it's paraphrasing W.C. Fields, sort of never go on after Children and Animal Acts, never go on after Sarah Longwell. I mean, I think this is like, you've all been excited now. Now here is the boring portion of our program, which is particularly me. But this is the, it's sort of like we had the reverse meal, we had the dessert, even if it was a dessert we might not have always wanted to hear. Now you're getting your vegetables for the day. So I'm talking, I think in some ways I'm taking part of my theme is from Rick's talk yesterday about he gave us the first best and the second best. I'm going to give us, to some extent, the third best, which is something close to what we actually have, which is taking the locally centered system of running elections and seeing what are the challenges and particularly what, if anything, we can do to strengthen it. Because I think as he acknowledges, we're not going to get the first best anytime soon. I'm not sure how much second best we're going to get either. So I think one challenge for us is to think about the third best. Just as a reminder, our elections, the title of this conference is Election Law and Federalism, but it's really about localism. Because as Rick also pointed out yesterday, the vast majority, something like 48 of the 50 states, the elections are run at the local level, which includes not just the election day operation, but things like early voting, the sending of absentee ballots, the maintenance and securing of election machinery, canvassing, certifying, you name it. It's almost all done at the local level. It's also either partisan or bipartisan. That is to say, either we're talking about officials who are elected on a partisan line or appointed by a partisan, or boards that are composed of equal numbers of matched numbers of partisans. But very, very, very rarely we're talking about anything that remotely resembles nonpartisan. And often we're talking about officials who hold other positions. Typically the county clerk may also have other functions. So we're talking about really something enmeshed in the local system, and also a system which is largely locally funded. There's some state support for machine acquisition. There's been a little bit of federal money, very little, and mostly targeted for specific things, but it's an overwhelmingly local system, albeit a tiny, tiny fraction of local budgets. My understanding is I think the total cost of elections in the United States is about 1/4 of 1% of local government budgets, or about what they're paying for public parking. So locals are crucial, but in some ways it doesn't always get the full attention of local governments. I'd like to flag, because there was a lot of dumping on local governments. The surprising success of 2020, which I think owes a lot to local election administration, actually, to local resiliency and creativity. They were hit with the hardest challenge in history, which was the combination of COVID-19 and an incredibly intensely partisan election. They had a shift to mail balloting in half the states which hardly used mail balloting beforehand, including my own. They had to find new polling places to deal with 6 feet apart. If we remember 6 feet apart, most polling places, at least in cities, are tightly crowded. You're lucky if you have 6 inches apart. They had to find new polling places. They had to acquire PPE. They had to recruit poll workers. As we all know, poll workers tend to be on the older side, significantly older, something like 70% or over 70, and the same group of people who are the most vulnerable to COVID. So they had to partner with local businesses and local universities and community groups. They had sports teams to basically get the election to happen. Many of them pushed the legal envelope. Places like Maricopa and Harris County in Philadelphia and Madison, Wisconsin. And we're doing things like sending out absentee ballot applications to people who didn't ask for them, sending out ballots, creating drop boxes, creating mobile voting systems and 24-hour voting, which had not happened before. Many of them encountered state pushbacks. I was tracking litigation in Ohio and Iowa and Georgia and Texas and Arizona, where either political parties or state-level administrators tried to stop them. They typically lost at the local level, but not 100%, and often a lot of it was accomplished. They were even multiple challenges to their acceptance of the Center for Technology and Civil Life money, the so-called Zuckerbucks, where there were often lawsuits against that. Which leads us to where we are today, which is, I think, one consequence of 2020 is the heightened awareness of the centrality of local election administration. Everyone is on it now. It used to be totally under the radar. Everyone is really very aware of it. And that has led to sort of 2 consequences that I want to focus briefly on. One is the onslaught of attacks. It's and Rick has pointed to some of it. It's been in the media all the time. Some of the attacks are online, verbal, hate mail, threats of violence, denunciation, threats of hanging, things like that. The other has been legal. States passing laws, stripping local officials of powers. The power to send out unrequested absentee ballots, the ability to take money from nonprofits, the ability to work with local voter registration groups, the ability to actually generate their own rules and to depart in any way possibly from official state law, as well as the imposition by states of detailed rules governing observation by election watchers, not to be confused with election workers, which we had some discussion of yesterday, and much more detailed and onerous reporting requirements. So on the one hand, they're being stripped of their ability to engage in innovation and resiliency while being burdened and also being subject to criminal penalties. There's now a new criminalization of all sorts of minor violations and an expansion of the powers of poll watchers to, in effect, have close, in-your-face observation of what's going on at polling places with civil and criminal penalties, or civil or criminal penalties for failure to apply. So one whole thing is the attack, and the other is the heightened attention to local elections and the election of local election administrators, the election of poll workers, the MAGA-ification of these really under the radar elections. And we've seen, and it was, again, Rick alluded to this yesterday, rogue officials, people who are refusing to count ballots, people who are refusing to certify ballots, people breaking security, and the possibility that we will have more of them elected, and we will have poll workers, banned and recruited poll workers doing these things. So where do we go from here? The threats may be easier to address, possibly, than the elections, but they're addressed in different ways. We need laws, and I think they're being discussed, and some are being developed, to beef up protection for election workers, both at the federal and state level. We need more money. The states that have stripped out the ability to accept private donations have not replaced the private donations with public funds. We may want to, there was some talk yesterday about federal legislation protecting the right to vote. It ought to focus, some of that, if there is going to be federal legislation, there ought to be some focus on protecting poll workers and maybe even preempting some of the limits on the ability of poll workers to do their jobs that are being adopted at the state level, at least for federal elections, which conveniently often tend to overlap with state elections. There may be efforts to develop arguments based on the ADA dealing with some of the laws that make it more difficult for poll workers to work with people with disabilities. And maybe beyond that, we should be thinking more generally about simplifying the rules of elections so that there are fewer minor errors for poll workers to trip over and be sued for. There are some, and I think, I know this is, Rebecca's work deals with this, and this also relates to Rick's earlier point about value of transparency. I think we have to think a lot about the balancing of transparency with the harassment effects of observation, the harassment purposes, the weaponization of observation. And I don't know the answer to that, just as I think we have to balance the issues about state oversight, state efforts to block local initiatives to expand the franchise, and at the same time, state efforts to oversee we may have more rogue local officials. As for the other half, and I'm done, or I'm 1 minute away from, 2 sentences away from being done, which is the magnification of people running. There, I think we did get the answer from Sarah's presentation, which is elections. And I think it is time for people who are either professionals or progressives to begin to give much more attention to these very low-level elections, because I think the only way to counter the magnification of the election administration is for a counter-mobilization of people who are committed to professional election administration.
Thanks. I think you'll hear in some of my comments some similar things that come out of it. Elections are a uniquely local function in the United States, and the big overall theme about what I'm going to say about this is that maybe it's not a bad thing, and that it's a pretty counter message to some of what we heard yesterday. And so by way of background in the introduction, Aaron said that I work with the National Association of Election Officials. As part of that work, the faculty at Auburn serve as the curricular faculty for their SERA certification program, and over the past more than a decade now, we've worked closely with many hundreds of election officials around the country. And in 2016, one of the things that came out as a narrative in the media was that our election administration approach in the country maybe was broken, and that there's a real problem. And the folks that I work with through the SERA program really felt like that this actually wasn't true. It didn't reflect our experiences working with election officials around the country. So my colleague Kathleen Hale and I embarked on a 3-year journey where we went around the country, we interviewed election officials, we ran focus groups, we did surveys with stakeholder groups, we did site visits with election offices, both during elections and in between elections. And from it came a book that we wrote that came out in 2020 from Georgetown University Press about innovation and how innovation happens in elections. And the story of elections in the United States is really a story focused on innovation and adaptation. And one of the things that we suggest in the book is we put forward an innovation theory of change, where from our analysis, what we saw happening is that places that were able to really adapt to changing local needs and changing local demands were places where there was high professionalization, where the politics in that state allowed for a lot of administrative discretion, and there were resources available to adapt programs in order to meet the needs of the people, meet the needs of voters, meet the needs of candidates. And so what we saw was actually a really good story about good government, and what's happening in the United States is a story about good government, and where innovation wasn't possible and where you see stagnant election administration, a lot of that is driven by resources and by politics that don't allow for a lot of administrative discretion. I think where we ought to look and where we ought to be focusing some of the analysis as we talk about fixing what's broken now is looking at the parties. We all know in the room that the purpose of political parties is that they're private groups designed to try and control government and policy by having their members elected to office. And I think the problem that we're facing in this moment is a party failure problem where they've lifted up first principles around power for power's sake and winning at all costs, and have abandoned other really important first principles that the country's really founded on. And so part of the solution ought to be getting back to that. I will also add that I don't think we should be afraid of political competition. There's a fundamental aspect of democracies, period, that's around political competition. One of the things that we've done over the years is developed an index to try and measure the effectiveness of election administration across the states, and then drilling down, looking at local election capacity. And when we look at that index and where the states measure up against each other over time, what we don't see is states with nonpartisan elected chief election officials performing better, or bipartisan boards performing better than people who are competitively elected to run elections. That in fact there's a wash, and they're all performing in terms of highs and lows in really similar ways, and what distinguishes the states is about resources and the amount of time and attention that has been put into professionalizing the election officials there. So there's a real piece of this story that is about resources. Understanding how much money is available for election administration is actually remarkably complicated. In one study we did, we tried to create a ratio of election office budgets to county budgets. We did this using data from 10 states. What we found, similar to what Richard mentioned, the average was about 0.5% of the overall county budget for elections, so there was a great deal of variance in that, and depended on the state that we're in, and by underfinancing these local offices, we really actually do some real damage to what can be done. So a couple of takeaways from this. The first thing I'd ask us to do is be really careful about language and how we talk about what the problems are, and separating the things that are under the purview of local election administration and even state election administration and laws from what's going on. Good examples of this would be the EPI and the Democracy Index. They told a really interesting story, but both of these as tools conflated things that are under the control of election officials with things that are not under the control of election officials. And what people would do with the measures that came out of this is say, oh, look at these places where there's bad election administration. There wasn't bad election administration in many of those places. Some of it's about bad laws, and so we have to be careful about conflating that. Most people don't understand the nuances and the distinctions, and so as a default, the criticism becomes about bad people doing bad things, and I think this is where some of the momentum came for focusing on election officials doing bad things with the election. The other thing I think we should be careful about in terms of language is talking about this idea of theory of weakest link of election administration. I think this really doubles down on people as the problem, and the people running those offices as the problem, and in many ways is an insult to public service and people who are really strong people doing good work under very constrained circumstances. So the big problems as I see them are around under-resourcing, laws that limit what election officials can really do, and parties whose first principle really is about power and just power for power's sake. In terms of long-term solutions, obviously, I think it's clear that from my comments that I think we need to think about funding elections a little bit differently, but also at the same time allowing for a lot of administrative discretion. Election officials are they're professionals, they're not factory line workers. I think there's a reaction to things that happened in the country 50, 75, 100 years ago to try and limit that discretion. I don't think that's the environment we're working in right now, and more discretion I think is probably better than less. And I think we need to renorm ourselves as a country about first principles. I hate to say this it sort of goes against some things I personally believe in, but I think we need to go back to some real fundamentals around civics education and ethics education about what the purpose of a democracy is. In the short term, I agree that we've got a problem with election deniers who are going to be in offices. I think actually Maricopa County is a positive story about maybe some of the ways that this can go right. If you look at the history here, Adrian Fontes ran for recorder because he was sure that Helen Purcell had done some terrible things and that he could do a better job. He got in that office and he was like, oh, wait, this is hard. And the people working in this office are actually really tremendous and they're great. And then Steve Richter did the same thing. He ran for office. Adrian Fontes is a hack and I'm going to do this better. He got into this office and within 6 months was publicly talking about what a wonderful job the people in those offices were doing. And so I do think that we're going to have to be careful about some of the deniers, and we're really going to have to trust in the state courts because I think that's where some of this is going to end up. But in the long run, positive message.
So I tend to be the optimist in the room. Well, first, let me thank everyone here at ASU and the Wisconsin Center as well for what an incredible conference. It's been great to reconnect with old friends and make some new ones. So thank you for this great conference. So yeah, I tend to be the optimist on the panel, although I share a lot of the gloom that we've been hearing this whole time, especially when it comes to Supreme Court, for example, which I think is also made a very anti-democracy turn, something I'm writing about right now. But I'm going to try to bring some optimism as well, because I think that if we just wallow in the doom and gloom without thinking about, okay, what is possible and what's worked already, then I sort of feel like we have a sense of just throw up our hands, instead of making real progress. And so I like to highlight places and policies where we had some really good successes as a mechanism to try to emulate those in other areas. So I live in Kentucky, and in 2019, we had a pretty contested campaign for Secretary of State. The previous Secretary of State was a Democrat. She was term limited, so it was an open seat. And the candidates were a Republican named Michael Adams, who had served on the State Board of Elections and was an election lawyer for the Republican, I think it was Republican Governors Association, maybe. And then the Democrat was a woman who had run the Veterans Affairs Department, and also had been was a former Miss America. During the summer, Mike Adams, who I didn't really know that well, gave me a call. Or I think it was initially a text message, and he said, "If I win, will you be on my transition team?" And my first reaction was, well, this is crazy because everything you seem to stand for in your campaign is things I object to. And so I told him, well, that's a little weird. Your number one campaign promise is implementing a strict photo ID law in the state, and I oppose that. I oppose that strongly. And he said, yeah, that's why I want you on my transition team. And I thought, okay, maybe this guy's got something going on, or he wants someone who's actively opposing him to advise him if he wins. He ended up winning, and so I served on that transition team, and Kentucky did pass a photo ID law. But I would say that it is one of the most mild forms of a photo ID law in the country, and that's because it has a lot of fail-safe. And I happen to, I had the fortune of being part of a lot of these conversations, and so we implemented things like student IDs count and they don't need an expiration date. If you show up to the polls, and this is the big one, if you show up to the polls and you don't have your ID, instead of having to have a provisional ballot, which many other states do, you say I have a reasonable impediment to having an ID, and then I have to fill out a provisional ballot. Instead, in Kentucky, you can fill out that affidavit saying I don't have an ID, and then you vote a regular ballot like everybody else. And why did we get a lot of these fail-safe mechanisms? I think in part is because county clerks were in the room to discuss policy proposals and what works and what doesn't work. And so my overarching message is that when thinking about election policy on the ground, we have to include the local election administrators as part of that conversation. I talked to Kentucky state legislators and legislators in other states as well, and they all think, I know what election policy works. But as I try to tell them, as nicely as I can, running for election doesn't mean you know how to run an election. And they think just because they were campaigning, they know what makes sense for election policy because, well, they won under the system. But as we've already heard, it's election professionals who are on the ground in county clerk's offices all over the country running our 8,000 simultaneous elections. And so why did we get things like no provisional ballots? So, you can show up to the polls and vote a regular ballot. Because the county clerks in Kentucky said, we don't want to deal with a whole bunch of provisional ballots. It's a logistical nightmare for them. And if so, we can get a photo ID law like the Secretary of State wants, and we can talk about why he was pushing it. But in part, it was he said, "Well, I campaigned on the issue, and so I want to deliver on the issue." And he sort of didn't care what form it took, as long as he could say to his base, "Well, we've improved our elections through a photo ID law." So he was very open to all the various things we got in the bill to make it so that really wouldn't harm voters all that much, including this provisional balloting. And it was the county clerks that were so instrumental in saying, no, you can't do this and require someone who shows up and doesn't have a photo ID to cast a provisional ballot because it's going to make our lives so much more difficult. Another thing, so coupled with the photo ID law, we've gotten some positive voting rights reforms. Kentucky really became a national story. New York Times wrote it up about how there was good news coming out of a state that you wouldn't expect during all of these fights for and all these battles on voting rights. So what do? We expanded early voting. We had no early voting previously. Now we have 3 days of early voting. Now it's not great. I think we should have closer to 7 maybe, but 3 is better than 0. And again, why did we get that? The argument was that, and county clerks were instrumental in making this argument, that look, we can handle 3 days of early voting because that's going to ease the lines. And it's more in the cities in Lexington and Louisville where that really made a difference. But they could say, well, we can ease the lines on election day, which makes our processes better when we don't have angry voters waiting for us, if we have some days of early voting as well. And that was convincing to the Republican-dominated legislature. We also introduced an online portal to request absentee ballots. Again, we were sort of living in the dark ages, like a handful of other states, and so now you can go online. We instituted online voter registration in the previous Secretary of State's administration, but we got an online portal to request an absentee ballot. What do the county clerks say? We want an online system that makes sense and works because we don't want to be dealing with all these paper applications that are coming into our offices. That, again, takes longer to process. It's much harder to deal with. And so that's going to streamline the process for us. And also, the other thing that the state did is, and the Secretary of State, who I think should get a lot of credit, did was he made this argument that these sorts of reforms are both access enhancing and integrity measures at the same time. So why is an absentee balloting portal or early voting an integrity measure? Well, for absentee balloting, we can track where those requests are coming from, and we can put barcodes on the envelopes as they get sent out, so we can track it through the entire system. Now, of course, it makes life a lot easier for voters as well, for those who want to be able to request an absentee ballot online. But the integrity side of this was, well, we can watch the process. Similarly with expanding early voting, we spread it out a little bit, the argument goes, we can watch the process a little more carefully than if we're doing it all in one day when there's long lines at the polls. There's a ton of work to do. Kentucky, does not have the greatest election system. I was chatting earlier with Tammy about the Election Performance Index, this ranking of states in their election administration. And before these reforms, Kentucky was in like the 40s, mid 45 or something like that, in terms of the ranking of how elections are run. And with these reforms, we moved up to low 30s or so. And we still have a ridiculously arcane voter registration deadline of 4 weeks before the election. You still need an excuse to request an absentee ballot, although that's expanded somewhat. But I think it's been a national success story because we've expanded voting where so many other places have restricted voting. And one of the key inputs in how that was possible was the county clerks themselves were in the room where it happens, helping to make the argument. So State legislatures, I'm very skeptical of their ability. You know, they're so self-interested in running election policy. I'm very nervous about this Moore versus Harper case we've talked about, which is going to give even more deference to state legislatures. And it really doesn't make sense to have state legislatures being the ones to dictate election policy, because they're obviously very self-interested. They're going to pass laws that help keep themselves in power. But if we make a committed effort to get the election professionals actually in part of the conversation about what makes sense, I think you can have some success stories. So again, running an election doesn't make you an expert. Running in an election, that is, running for office, but running an election does make you an expert, and those are the people we need to hear from when we come up with election policy.
Couldn't agree more. All right. Thank you so much for having me, and this has been really an amazingly helpful learning experience, this panel and the others. So thank you for having me. So it's been hard to pick up a newspaper without seeing headlines that election deniers are overtaking our system of elections, whether it's running for Secretary of State, or rank-and-file Republicans seeking out local election offices at the local level, sorry. Of course, we saw this a second ago when we saw Steve Bannon himself urging, for Republicans to take over elections. The clear implication of these headlines and hand-wringing is that there's something catastrophic about the idea of members of a political party engulfed in partisan passion taking part in running our elections. And I think that's a really dangerous narrative. We're living in an environment in which apparently 70% of Republicans believe that the wrong person is in the White House. And I worry that this rhetoric will chip away at Democrats' faith in the election system. That will be in a situation where members of both parties lack faith in our elections. I think enemies of the democratic system of government will rejoice if that is in fact the case. So reformers have long called for nonpartisan election administration. We've heard several speakers here today discussing that possibility. And I take absolutely no issue with that position. I think nonpartisan election administration is undoubtedly the gold standard, and why so many advanced democracies around the world adopt that model. But as Rick suggested yesterday and others have mentioned, truly nonpartisan election administration in the United States is sort of a not in my lifetime proposition. It would involve a complete reorganization of a very decentralized election system, and so at least for the short term, it seems clear that we're sort of stuck with what we have. Alarmed by the concern about these headlines, about this partisan takeover, further damaging public confidence in our elections, I spent the summer working on what I've pitched as a plucky counter-narrative, an attempt to counter the narrative that partisanship in election administration is something to fear. The argument I try to make is that adversarial partisan election administration, by design, seeks to provide increased transparency and checks and balances in how elections are run. Further, I argue that adversarial election administration is deeply ingrained in how American institutions function generally. The American system abounds with diffused and fragmented and purposefully adversarial power structures in nearly every facet, from federal agencies to our system of justice. We rely on adversarialism to function as a check on power and as a vital transparency mechanism. So that elections are run by partisan actors from the two major political parties is deeply ordinary and familiar in the American context. In order to keep these remarks brief, I won't go into the details of describing the many different forms of partisan election administration in this country throughout history and at present. Everything from bipartisan election boards at the state and local level to requirements that election workers hail from opposing political parties to the structure of partisan poll watching, where observers act as agents for political parties and candidates. All of these are examples of the adversarial administration of election and that process at work. It's certainly the case that adversarial election administration or partisan election administration in this country has been problematic in US history. You don't have to look further than single-party dominated election administration in the Jim Crow South, or of course, the sort of party machines in northern cities running corrupt elections for much of this country's history. Yet, election designers throughout history and today rely on rival partisans to secure popular buy-in of election results. You know, anyone who's ever watched a recount where you have members of each party huddling over the recount table knows what I'm talking about. So rather than calling for reforms unlikely to happen in our lifetimes, it strikes me that we should instead be thinking of more realistic fixes, and that those fixes should start from the premise that partisan involvement in election administration is not a boogeyman. I don't mean to suggest in any way that adversarial partisanship in election administration can't be improved. It's far from a perfect system, and there are lots of vulnerabilities that reformers are rightly talking about. So, for example, power should not be concentrated in a single partisan chief election administrator at the state level. I'm worried about discretion for local partisan election administration. I think it should be limited so that partisanship can't sort of bleed into the process. States should have conflict of interest laws to prevent overtly partisan activity while someone is serving as an election official. But that said, I think the constant drumbeat that election deniers are taking over U.S. elections has real dangers. So from this foundation, I want to suggest what I think is a pretty controversial proposition, which is to say that just because somebody is an election denier, it does not necessarily follow that they are out to sabotage our elections or commit election malpractice, as it was termed yesterday. Rank-and-file Republicans who think that the election was stolen in 2020 truly believe that election laws were flouted. And I don't mean to sort of lump all election deniers into the same category. I realize that there are certainly some who would like to flout the law and make sure that their candidate wins. But I guess what I'm trying to argue is that the rank-and-file sort of regular person who's basically been convinced that the election was stolen, believes that the law was not followed. And so the idea I wanted to suggest is that it doesn't follow that if they gain positions within election administration as poll watchers or poll workers or even state or local election officials, that they will seek to flout the law themselves. In fact, there's an argument that they'll do the opposite, that they will insist that laws be followed to a T. So I think on this front, education is hugely important. The point came up yesterday that whether it's poll watchers or poll workers, making sure that those who administer our elections are clear on what the law requires is essential. But the hope is that when Americans of all political stripes truly engage in the process of elections up close, that some of the trust in our process of election will actually be restored. And we shouldn't be afraid of partisans engaging in our election process. In fact, we should acknowledge it as a deeply American approach. I thought I'd end by mentioning a story from the Washington Post yesterday. I'm not sure if you all saw it, but apparently in the August primary, right here in Maricopa County, there were 18% more Democrats working at the polls than there were Republicans. And this past week, I guess last Tuesday, the RNC filed 2 lawsuits. One of the suits is to force the county to shorten shifts for poll workers to make jobs more accessible. My guess is that would mean that that would be problematic because shortening them would require recruiting more poll workers, and that might be difficult to do in this environment. The second suit seeks to force the release of records about who worked the polls in the primary, presumably to try to sort of unearth some kind of unequal treatment. But it seems that those records have actually already been released, so that lawsuit will probably be mooted. But the claim seems to be, and sort of the headline seems to be, that somehow Republicans were shut out of the process here in Maricopa County, which is odd because the article goes on to explain that there are about 100,000 more Republicans than there are registered Republicans than there are Democrats here. As it happens, and here's where my one slide's going to come in handy. I didn't want to read this to you because it's too long, but this is the statute in Arizona that governs who can be, who works the polls, essentially. here in Maricopa County. And as you can see, it's a model of adversarial election administration with requirements that there be equal numbers. So the election officials here in Maricopa County who've been responding to this lawsuit, or this series of lawsuits, are saying, we're trying to get equal numbers. It's the mandate in our statute, and it's simply not always possible, depending on who comes forward. That there were 18% more Democrats working the polls in Maricopa County is not sort of a nefarious plot. It's just how it shook out. Still, the remedy here seems to me for Republicans to do a better job of recruiting the party faithful to come to the polls here in Maricopa County. And that's indeed where I come down overall, which is that rather than disparaging partisan involvement in election administration at risk of reducing public confidence in the system, both parties should work harder to ensure that their members are front and center. A system in which local elections are chock full with Democrats and Republican officials working together to administer elections is perhaps the only viable path we have to secure public confidence in elections in the short term. So I'll stop there.
That was wonderful. We want to have some discussion. I want to start with a question that I think you guys all touched on, which is the amount of discretion. And this is where I apologize that there's going to be some overlap, but hopefully an invitation. What is the scope of the discretion that you are envisioning for local election officials? When you described balance, you described actual discretion, you described expertise in the room, and then Rebecca went back to discretion. So where do you see the scope of that discretion being really important? And if you want to offer some ideas of where you would go with limits, I'd be interested. And then after that, feel free to chat amongst yourselves, where I'll be interested.
I'll start and then we'll move it down. Where you start, Rebecca?
No, you
I'll
go.
give you a chance to catch your breath.
No, you're good.
Great
Perfect.
presentation. So,
Yeah.
it's the forest ranger, right? I mean, this is a sort of the essential thing in any form of administrative system. The cop on the beat, the forest ranger out on what we're looking for fires. Some degree of discretion is inevitable of the people actually carrying out the law, and running a program. What I was struck by looking at the record in 2020 was just literally like finding polling places, finding poll workers, making it easier for adapting in states like my own, which hardly had absentee ballots before, adapting the absentee ballot system to massive use. And I mean, we had some conversation over, breakfast and other things. There's just all sorts of minor rules. Part of, I mean, in some ways, another thing. I mean, and I think it was Mitchell made the point about separating out the election laws and the election administration. One thing to think about is we have, with the election administration, is maybe come up with ways of somewhat simplifying many of the hyper-technical requirements that go into the process, where, in some sense, some discretion is inevitable. Accepting that signature. Accepting the ballot that where you can't read the date, or maybe just the big debate, unbelievably or not, the big fight now whether or not in Pennsylvania to accept absentee ballots that have been returned on time but didn't have a date on them. So there's, I'm not sure I have a good answer I'd like to say, but systems don't work unless the people who are literally carrying out the system have some discretion to adapt what they're doing to current circumstances, whether it's COVID, whether it's a rainy day, whether it's some mechanical breakdown, and figure out how to do it.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we ought to look at is where we've had real advances in making elections more accessible to people and responsive to what voters need, and at the same time more efficient. And where a lot of those things have come from have been in places where state legislatures said, yeah, we do things in one particular way, but for this coming election, we're going to let you experiment with that. And it allows people at the local level to create new ways to do things that are better than what state legislatures might have dreamed up in session. And that's the kind of discretion that I think we need to be doing more of and not less of.
I think that there can be sort of a hybrid model for some of this stuff where there's discretion to the local election administrators to coming up with a election plan for an upcoming election, then could get maybe submitted to, if you had a bipartisan board or the chief election official, whoever it is, with a thumb on the scale of trusting the local election administrators, but with maybe a little oversight at the state level. I think that kind of a hybrid model could work. So, you want to have a plan of where your precincts are going to be or where your vote centers are going to be. That should be subject to the local election officials' discretion. They know where their voters are. They know, what their communities need. But to have kind of an oversight at the state level where, you really apply a kind of abuse of discretion type of standard that you're gonna essentially trust the local election administrators' plans unless there's something that looks really really messy that you need to send it back to them to redo. I think there could be, a dual level system where we trust the local election administrators, but with a little bit of oversight as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have too much to add, except to say that I'm really sympathetic to the idea that local administrators need a lot of discretion in order to cope with unforeseen circumstances and also just to do their job, and that we should, the default should be to trust them to make good decisions. But I guess, I guess I wonder whether, it opens up the sort of Pandora's box of exercising discretion in a way that people view as partisan or biased in some way, and so that's why sort of my prescription in sort of thinking about it is to sort of pull back from that. So I think maybe the answer is to think carefully about where the discretion is being given, and to make sure that it's not in instances where partisan bias would sort of be presumed. So I don't know if that's possible, but it's difficult.
Two more thoughts on that. Just one is Mitchell's comment. I think early voting, through vote centers, emerged as an administrative innovation before it was authorized by state law. So I think that was actually something that actually came out. Was it in Los Angeles or in Colorado, where they came up with the idea that it was going to actually simplify voting, but it predated any legal authorization for it. On the other hand, I'm sympathetic to Rebecca's point. It connects with her main presentation about, I think, some of the issues from 2020 were, in some sense, come out of a conflict between discretion to make voting more accessible, particularly during the pandemic, versus close adherence to the law. And in some ways, we saw that going back to 2000 and Bush v. Gore, and sort of the make every vote count versus follow the law. And I think, because one of so much of the attack has been on absentee voting, when a lot of states, like my own, we went to absentee voting by executive order. And so only a handful of states, I think Nevada and New Jersey, may have actually changed their laws to expand absentee voting during the election. Most of the states that made the shift from excuse-based absentee voting to no excuse were done by executive order. And I think that, to some extent, colored the perception that this was arguably lawless because it was being done by executive order and without legislation. And I think that was part of it, just as moved to drop boxes, things like that, which were neither prohibited nor authorized, became, and you could sort of see the tension that you allude to between the impulse to make the franchise as accessible as possible and the alternative impulse. And to some extent, this does correlate with party, if not necessarily partisan advantage, then partisan philosophy. And the other is to stick to the rules and follow the rules. And most people can follow the rules, and the ones who can't, that's too bad.
But I want to underscore that 99% of local election administrators are not trying to act in a partisan way. That we hear about the bad apples, but these people are just professional election administrators who their ultimate goal is to run a smooth election that where their voters can vote, and they're not trying to be partisan. Now we do have to worry about those who are going to be overtly partisan, but I think the majority of the people running elections are not that.
Do you guys have questions for each other before we turn or follow up?
Yeah, just to keep us going with Josh. They may not want to be partisan, but I think sometimes those who want, or my sympathy is to make it easier to vote, more accessible, help overcome barriers. may be perceived as partisan by other people. And I think that connects with Rebecca's point, is that particularly in the big urban counties, particularly 2020, because of all of the special issues in 2020, there were some in big urban counties where at least the election administrators, I think, took the extra steps to make it easier for people to vote in ways that were arguably beyond, or not clearly authorized, arguably beyond maybe pushing the envelope, and that was perceived as partisan, even if they perceived that they were, and I would agree with them, that they were just doing their job. So I think being partisan, being perceived as partisan, and just doing your job could be the same thing.
Yeah, no, that's fair. But again, I think I would put the thumb on the scale of discretion for those election administrators. Again, with perhaps some sort of oversight, but the oversight has to be one which ultimately trusts, in my view, trust the local election administrators, unless there's clear evidence that they're really trying to put the scale on one side or the other. So I think you're right that perhaps, and I don't know have a good answer to how to deal with the perception of it, but it doesn't change my own conclusion that that by and large we should be allowing the local election administrators some level of discretion. Oh my goodness, what do we do?
Delay lunch, I think, is the answer. Maybe. I'm gonna look to Karen.
We must be controversial with all those hands going up.
Thank you for this great perspective, and I agree with a lot of it. And I think another area where maybe there's been some great creativity is in this were the audits and pilots that were happening, in the last decade or so at the level you're talking about. But I wanted to push on another point that Rebecca mentioned, and sort of stepping down from the election boards to the poll workers and talking about encouraging people from both parties who maybe want to come out to be poll workers. And so just to tie it back to Sarah Longwell's talk, we all just listened to Steve Bannon, and you've probably heard this before, and his kind of, literal, figurative, whatever, call to arms. He's talking about the military, he's talking about the police, he's talking about public servants. How do you kind of square that perspective? Because you're talking about partisanship, but even setting that aside and bad apples, and that there aren't that many of them. But when we're hearing this, and this is aggressive, and this is happening apparently every day for an hour or whatever on his show, where do you see that going? Do you have less optimism about that? Do you think that's just going to be a drop in the bucket? Or just curious your perspective.
Well, so I think it's interesting, right? I mean, it's not the first time that we've had this call to arms at the polls. I mean, we saw it in 2016, we saw it before 2020, where you had various actors, mostly on the right, calling for, people to show up at the poll, like armies of poll watchers and so forth. And that didn't materialize, probably in large part in 2020 at least, because people voted by absentee and there wasn't much happening at the polls as compared to previous years. But I think it's interesting that here we have Bannon calling for this army of election workers, and yet the RNC is filing suit in Maricopa County because the discrepancy and not enough Republicans there. So I guess I think when it comes down to it, working at elections does take time and effort, and it does take a certain commitment to democratic principles. And so I think the kind of militancy about go in there and take it over doesn't translate in practice, or at least we haven't seen it translate in practice so far. So I feel like this may be really naive to say, but I feel like most Americans are good people who want to follow the law and won't respond to calls to flout it. Controversial.
Super interesting. One feature of the decentralized institutions of U.S. election administration are that it's hard to know how much is spent nationally on election administration compared to other developed democracies. And one way in the bureaucracy, political economy literature to make bureaucracies more professional and engaged is to pay, bureaucrats more. Is that, how much do you think we spend compared to other developed democracies, and is paying election workers and administrators more viable option?
Yeah, I'll start an answer to this question. We grossly underpay people who do this work. One of the things that we know from the studies that we've done is that even people in equivalent jobs in the same counties who work in elections make less than the people who do the same kind of work in a different area. And that's a problem. One of the things that we've noticed as a faculty in doing training, Auburn has worked with the Election Center with their training program for over 30 years now, and the people who are going into elections are very different now, even than when they were 15 years ago, 10 years ago, when I started working with the election officials and doing some of the training classes. The amount of education they bring to it, the amount of professionalism and background they bring to it is regularly increasing. And what we know from looking at professionalization of other fields is that that there's lots of really wonderful things that come with that. The information sharing that happens through the various types of national networks among election officials actually helps spread best practices and the ability of people to do better jobs even in the face of limited resources. And so we need to be supporting that kind of thing much more than we're doing. And I think the field will continue to grow in that way. One of the problems with it, though, is that there's a real divide between what's able to happen in very, very small jurisdictions and what's able to happen in really large jurisdictions. And so in the small jurisdictions, you have 2 or 3 people doing all of this while they're doing some other things as well. And so they're generalists, and they might be advanced generalists in some ways when it comes to elections. But the ability to really have high-level knowledge about real specific nuanced things in those offices as compared to an LA County is just completely different. And it means that there's a real divide in terms of capacity. And I think that's one of the things. And there have been ways that folks have been trying to get around this by sharing resources across counties and jurisdictions. But that divide between the really wealthy places and the poorer places, or just small amounts of people, so less tax base, is something we need to pay attention to.
Just one minor factoid on how little we know. The census does, I think it's every 5 years, a census of state and local government finance, and it's broken out by categories. They don't have a category for elections because it's so small. So it's literally not broken out. So it's part of the problem is we have no idea collectively in individual places, but we have no idea collectively how much is being spent. The assumption is it's quite small.
I don't know the cues, so I'll have to forget.
Hi, I thought this was really great, really useful, definitely on team local election official here. So one thing I found really interesting, Josh, in your comments was the fact that local clerks were in the room when that sort of bipartisan success happened in Kentucky. And I'm just interested in what folks' thoughts are about how to make that happen. One of the complaints I hear a lot when I interview local election officials is that they are not consulted, they are not included when there's election law reform happening. And even when they try to be included, they're not listened to. And it really, really varies by state. Like there are certain states where, I think like Florida has a supervisors association that seems like they really have a lot of pull with the legislature. So I'm just interested in folks' thoughts about like what can be done to improve that access to political reform in that process.
So yeah, I'll start off and say that Kentucky also has Kentucky Clerks Association, and they hired as its lobbyist a former Secretary of State, Trey Grayson, who is great as an election administrator. So I don't know the history of how they got to have that kind of influence, but I do know that the legislature does listen to them, and they were brought into the conversations. And maybe, since you pointed to Florida as well, that maybe having a lobbying group for the clerks or the election officials is at least that's consistent in Kentucky, and maybe one reason they were in the room.
Yeah, I'll add and just expand on that and say I think the places that do the best job of this and having local election officials listen to are places with strong state associations. The Democracy Fund was, Tammy's in the room, and we'll hear from her in the next panel, really a leader in trying to bolster the strength of those state associations. There's a lot of difference across the countries in terms of the quality and the work of those state associations. And I think part of that is a function of how diffused the election offices at the local level are too. I mean, so we have some states where there's one person, or not one person, one office running all aspects of elections. You have other states where you might have 2 different offices in the county, some with doing one and some doing another, and it means you end up with 2 state associations. Alabama is the most diffuse in the country, with the exception of Jefferson County. There are 5 different local offices involved in various aspects that have to coordinate with each other, which means there are 5 different state associations. The money for these state associations come from the people working in them, and so the amount of money, the pay, all of these things then influence what the strength of those associations look like, and so I think that's something we ought to be thinking about too in building as well.
Do we have, I think, see 2 more questions. Carol, are we good if we postpone? Okay, great.
So I learned a lot from this panel, even though I'm on the other side of the question of centralization, but I want to focus specifically on the issue of election subversion and what to do right now for 2024. I heard Josh say a few bad apples. I heard Rebecca say election deniers running elections, maybe not so bad. I heard Mitchell say don't focus on the weakest link. I think I didn't hear Richard with any of the kind of optimism about dealing with election denialism. But if we go back to the forest ranger analogy, we have a raging forest fire coming up in the next election. I don't think saying state courts will handle it is enough. And while ordinarily I can see the argument for having discretion in the hands of local election officials, look at Tina Peters sharing the software that runs the Dominion voting machines with Mike Lindell of MyPillow. I think we need to think about in the short term how we deal with the problem of either people who are delusional, which is Rebecca's optimistic explanation of what's going on, or people who are liars. Why should I trust those people running elections? And I'm much more concerned not about the poll worker, but about the county election official, the county clerk, or the Secretary of State.
Shall I give it a crack? So I think my response, and what I'm trying to suggest here, is an approach that doubles down on adversarial partisanship. So when you have someone who is acting out of the bounds, who's breaking norms, to have sort of an internal pushback sort of built in, and I'm more optimistic about that happening at the local level than I am, for example, with a Secretary of State who's an election denier, kind of who has more unilateral power at the top to make mischief. And that's why I'm totally on board with taking power and discretion away from centralized sort of state level election administrators. But I guess in the end, where we've seen the crazy stuff happening, like in Otero County and in other places where where there's been this attempt to flout the law. I know you don't think maybe courts are the solution, but in those instances, so far at least, and obviously this is in between elections, but that is where you turn when someone doesn't follow the law. And I know that Gowrie has been doing some interesting work in Nevada, where is it Nevada where they're insisting on counting by hand? And so I think there's a lot of work to be done to take sort of the more extreme forms of election denialism, thinking that something is fishy when really nothing is fishy, and reining it in. But that seems like where we should be focusing our efforts on ensuring that the law is followed, and that we should all agree that whatever the law is what should be the final answer.
I guess I have 3 kind of short responses. I also agree that state courts can serve as a bulwark, and so I'm more optimistic about that. In part because we heard yesterday from the panel about the power of state courts and the fact that they have more tools, just as a constitutional matter, to deal with these issues. And so, I do think that state courts can be a useful check. The second thing is I do think that voter education about election processes is really important, that we do need to educate people about how this stuff works, and so that if they see Tina Peters or whatever doing things that is not consistent with the rule of law, that the voters, I know you've talked about, at some point we're going to need peaceful protests about democracy, and educating people about the processes of local election administration, I think, can be a key tool to serve as a check on that. And the third point, I'm going to be really pessimistic here, which is not normally my role. But ultimately, if no one's going to follow the rule of law, how do you prevent the January 6th when you have people intent on storming the Capitol? I mean, we have to trust in the rule of law, and if we don't have the rule of law at any level whatsoever, I don't know what you do about that. So I think we do have to place trust in some of our institutions, and I find the state courts to be, right in this current moment, a stronger mechanism than the federal courts, for sure. That combined with educating people, I think, is the only answers to, otherwise there is no rule of law, and then we don't have a democracy.
Yeah, quickly, I'd say nobody certifies elections the day of the election or the day after. We have certification periods because there are these built-in checks to make sure we got the right answer. That doesn't solve the problem of state certification of electors and the Electoral College. I think that'll be a real test, and that is a problem in the short term. But we have these checks in place, and I'm just obviously much more optimistic about the institutions than you are.
Apologies, I am seeing both questions in the audience and more comments from our panelists, but lunch is outside, and I think people might be getting hungry. So I want to hope that this conversation continues into the afternoon. Thank you guys so very much, and thank all of you so very much.